Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Turning the Goldfields Green. Today is a thematic bookend to episode 14 in which we looked at the start of life and how to do babies and nappies sustainably. Today we fast forward to the other end of life and are exploring what it means to pass back to the earth as gently as possible. I have spoken with Libby Moloney from Natural Funerals in Woodend about what choices are available to us at the end of life. I also have an interview with Helen Bodicomb, a Castlemaine artist who exhibited a work called Shroud in her PhD exhibition last year. But before we get to it, as ever, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change. Saltgrass.
Listen to all episodes of Turning the Goldfields Green on saltgrass.podbean.com.
Natural grace really is a sacred and sustainable and an authentic response for me to the deeply human need to be able to honour our dead in a way that's authentic for us as individuals. And so what I felt, my background is I'm an accountant. I had lived in, worked professionally as an accountant for most of my adult life until about 10 years ago. And I had been widowed as a young woman when I was 26, when my husband died and left me with our 2-year-old child at the time. And that had been horrible and sad and awful and a bit of a shock. And we were cared for by a funeral company who did a perfectly acceptable professional job. Absolutely fine. But there was no choices or guidance or advice or support about how to have a funeral that really would have suited my Peter. At the time, it was fine because nobody was talking like that. Nobody was sort of saying, well, what does an individually crafted and carefully put together funeral ceremony look like for a man that had been a poet? You know, like, what do you do with a 2-year-old that's traumatised and needs more? So it wasn't a thing. It just wasn't. And I went along with that because nobody told me that it could have been differently, I suppose, when I was young and traumatised and all that sort of stuff. So at the time, I don't ever name that funeral director and I don't ever criticise that funeral director because they did a perfectly acceptable job. It just could have been so much better, could have been so much more different, you know. So jump forward sort of, I don't know, that's 20-something years ago now, so jump forward sort of 10 years from there and having pretended I was fine for 10 years, I really realised that I wasn't fine and thought there's more, there has to be more. This had to have served me and my child and the memory of my beautiful Peter. It had to have been better. So I suppose partly drawing on my accounting skills, my capacity to run a business and all those sort of things, I really said, right, well, nobody else is doing it. I need to do this. So I spent many, many, many years researching and exploring the deep cultural practice around end of life and funeral rituals and ceremonies. I talked to everybody I could get my hands on. I travelled the countryside. I did everything to really explore what could funeral care look like? How could it be more meaningful? How could it be kept in the home? How could it be sustainable? How could it be real for people and not have this sort of unusual disconnected experience right at the last time in your life where you should be having a disconnected experience?
It's often a traditional funeral is often very formal and sort of stiff. And I guess for some people that helps keep them together so they can actually get through the day.
100%.
Yeah.
And we do formal, lined up in rows, everybody in black suit funerals. We do them because that's what's authentic and meaningful and real for some families.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a right or wrong here.
Yeah.
It's about someone spending enough time with you to really listen, to understand which version of funerals is right for you and your family. So going to church or being in a formal setting like that, or lined up, in a chapel or somewhere like that, is absolutely what some families need. Culturally, socially, traditionally, what they've done in their family, that's the most meaningful for them. Then they're just as beautiful as the ones that are, picnics in a paddock with everybody having brought their own food on platters to share, and the bonfire going and digging the grave at the cemetery or whatever. They're all beautiful. It's just about what makes it beautiful is that it's meaningful and authentic. And if those two things haven't happened, then it can just be sort of mechanical, I suppose, really. We've ticked the box and it's what we've done. So, essentially I had resisted being a funeral director for a long time because the idea of it, at that time, 10 odd years ago, funerals, it's very administrative. It's very much sitting in an office ticking boxes and everything, and having coming out of a redreaming my life and not wanting to be an accountant anymore. The idea of doing that again didn't really interest me, to be honest. Eventually, I just woke up in the middle of the night and went, give in, you've got to do this. You just got to do it your way, So Natural Growth was born that night, and we've gone from there, from looking after, I don't know, maybe 5 families in the first couple of months. We now look after over 200 families a year.
And you're in 2 locations, aren't you?
Yeah, so our sanctuary, which is our head office, if you like, is in Woodend, which has been a bit unusual too, because normally entering the funeral market or the funeral industry as a new player with no family connections or no background, no experience, was a risky manoeuvre. And the other was doing that from a country town of 5,000 people. Pretty dumb, really. But anyway, we did it, and we have families all over the state that come to us. And by anybody's measure, we're doing really well. We've also got a little care centre in Brunswick East in the city, and that came about mostly because we look after so many babies. And we just needed to create a central place in the city where families, who are accessing all the main maternity hospitals in town can get easy and comfortable access to us. So we look after adults and everyone from there, but that's mostly our little baby team. We've got 3 exquisite women who run our baby team, and they all work from there. So there's a couple of key stages in caring for babies. Just quickly, the opportunity for proper attachment that you need to be able to attach to your baby before you can let it go. So we talk about saying hello before you say goodbye. You have to get to know them and hold them and connect them. And then you need to have meaningful funeral care for them as well. So that could be, for some families, a little graveside service. For some, it's a full funeral, the whole everything. But for most, it's they say goodbye at the end of what we call a vigil, so the time that they have with their baby. And we do some, mother-to-mother time in there, or mother-to-parent time, and they'll change their baby or wrap them or smuggle them all into their little wicker basket coffins and actually parent them, get those opportunities for parenting, and then managing how they have either the little ashes returned to them and what they do with setting up little altars in their house, little sacred spaces for their babies, or the graves if they've chosen burial. So we're finding that if all those steps happen well and thoroughly, and the families have got plenty of time, and that the parents are held until such time as they surrender the next stage, they go, yes, we're ready for the next stage now, then we're finding we're getting really good bereavement outcomes.
That's great. So are your team trained in psychological guidance?
Yeah, we've been actually asked a few times lately, complimentarily, you guys are amazing at this, are you psychologists? No, we're not. None of us are trained psychologists. But we are. We have regular professional development in all aspects of human behaviour and good care. But essentially, our mantra is we start the day with kindness. That if we start everything with kindness, if we have plenty of patience and genuine interest and concern for the family, then we're experienced enough in this. We've done it so much now that we can say, these are the options before you. If you go down this path, this is what it will look like, this is what it will sound like, smell like, be like. How does that feel versus this path, where this will happen, which is, that sort of thing. So mostly we're just kind to people. I suppose coming to the industry with fresh eyes and not that this is the way we've always done it attitude. So we've had to start from scratch. Everything we've done on our own. None of us had prior funeral experience. So we've really gone on the especially kindness. How does this work? How do we kind to the earth? How do we kind to each other? How do we be kind to as much as we can, and then just some common sense and a lot of trial and error. And it just constantly amazes us how much the community actually does want this kind of care. We thought we'd have to do a lot of very standard funerals till we broke into, offering this really individual care. And it's been quite the opposite. It's total opposite.
People are hungry for it.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
You mentioned care for the earth is one of your key thoughts as you go into it. Tell me about how you consider the environment in your business.
Look, essentially, sustainable funeral care is by what we don't do than what we do. So if you look at the sort of primary hallmarks of the funeral industry and its impact on the environment, it comes down to there's some sort of key leading factors. One is embalming the dead, so the sort of removal of all the bodily fluids and replacing them with chemical, which is formaldehyde. And the impact not only on the earth and when that body's buried, or on the atmosphere when it's cremated, that sort of thing, but mostly on the worker health of the people that are doing it. So that's a big aspect of it. Things like the coffins that people are placed in and manufacturing life cycle of those coffins, where they've come from, what's the materials, where are they being made, what the environment that they're being made in, how do they break down, all that sort of thing. So that's another aspect. We could talk about this for hours.
Yeah.
There's things like where we bury the dead and or cremate them and how. So there's been a lot of discussion, and there's better resources than me for you to go and find the impact of cremation on and the whole rise of the idea of natural burial grounds. It's, where we hold ceremony, who comes, what do we buy and consume to have that, all those sort of things, how many cars are driving to the space. There's a lot to consider. So what we really do is say, well, what things can we do that aren't those things? So our company is totally chemical free. We don't ever embalm anybody and never have had to, with the exception of one repatriation to New Zealand where you have to legally have the person embalmed, and we took that person to a trusted colleague and they performed that service for us. But other than that, we don't have any care. So all our mortuary care is warm water, essential oil and love. There's nothing else.
Yep.
And it works and it's beautiful. And our holistic mortician, Jackie, is a goddess. But we watch people's bodies change because, the music that's being played in the room is right for them. The way Jackie talks to them or sings to them is right for them. Or we're helping the family be the people that wash the body and get them dressed and ready. And it's extraordinary how the body, even though it's just a body and the spirit's gone, if you like, can still respond to that kind of care. So that's a big part of it. All our coffins, the only coffins we'll sort of stock here are, made from sustainably harvested timbers or sewn or grown or all out of natural materials.
Yep.
We pioneered the practice of what's called shrouded cremation. So shrouded, the body's shrouded, so it's just wrapped in cotton, and it's laid on a simple piece of timber that we call a shroud bearer, and that's all that's cremated. So the body's in its natural state. If it's dressed, it's only dressed in natural material. It's wrapped in natural material. It's placed on a single piece of timber.
Yep.
And then cremated without a coffin or anything. So you're looking at the lowest possible impact environmentally of what is being pumped into the atmosphere, if you like, by doing that. There's also huge savings in terms of cost, but also materials by not using coffins.
Can I ask a few tricky questions around that?
Yeah, sure.
Because I'm assuming you don't have your own crematorium, you'd have to go elsewhere. Are there ways to have that done with green power, or does it it always gas, or is it, because I know they have to reach certain temperatures?
Yeah, that's right. In Victoria, all cemeteries and crematoriums are owned by public trust. So funeral directors can't own their own crematorium.
Yeah.
So you have to go to somewhere.
Yeah.
So generally we go to Bendigo, to Remembrance Park, Central Victoria at Bendigo. But we also do a lot, all over Melbourne, Ballarat.
Yeah.
And I think probably in terms of at least documenting what they're doing, Geelong Cemetery Trust does a lot of work on that. But yeah, I'm pretty sure they're all gas.
In terms of the shrouds that you are offering people, they're cotton. Are they organic cotton, or do people have a choice of the fabric that they get to use?
Yep. So, often they'll choose their own, doona cover or sleeping bag, or they've chosen a beautiful piece of silk from their travels around the world, or generally, though, just a just a calico, It just depends what people want.
But people can actually make a really personal choice about the fabric.
They 100% can, yeah. So it's often a reused fabric. For natural burial, which is a bit different again, the person has to be placed in a specific burial shroud that's got the weight-bearing mechanism within it and has the straps for lowering the body into the ground. So it is a shroud that we actually provide. So the person who can be wrapped in whatever the family would like within it, but they have to use that for burial because it's the only weight-bearing one that we can actually get insured. They're gorgeous, and that's from an unbleached calico and hemp straps. Yeah, so it's good. So shrouded cremation is sort of, that's our big contribution to shift what's available.
So how did that come about?
I was actually being interviewed, not dissimilar to this, and the interviewer asked me that that their mum was claustrophobic, and the idea of being in a coffin just horrified this person's mother, and what couldn't she just wrap her up in a beautiful piece of cloth and take her to the crematorium? And it was very early in my funeral directing life, and I gave her the response, which I hate hearing from anybody else, which is, that's just the way it is, that's the way, and I can't remember exactly if I said, that's the law, or whether that's just the way it is.
Them's the rules.
Them's the rules. And then that got under my skin, and I just thought, that can't. Surely there's something we can do about this. So I scoured the legislation and came up for air out of that and went, no, this does not say you have to use a coffin. It just doesn't. So I went to the then CEO of Remembrance Park, Central Victoria, and said to him, I want to do this, why can't I? And he said, same thing, we've never done it, can't do it, it's not the way. And I went, And he came back to me a couple of days later and went, bloody hell, woman, you drive me crazy, blah, blah, blah. But you're right, you're right, you can. So we began the practice of shrouded cremation, pioneered in partnership with RPCV. And since then, we've been able to get, everyone else has picked it up, Geelong, Ballarat, Gippsland. And in Melbourne, there's two major cemetery trusts. One's called the Greater Metropolitan Cemetery Trust, and with a great deal of lobbying. Oh, my God, it took me ages. But I got them over the line. And there's another one called the Southern Metropolitan Cemetery Trust, and they won't have a bar of it. And that's okay. So, but it means that every single community in Victoria can now access shrouded cremation. And
it is all about choice, isn't it?
Yeah. And we get a lot of inquiry from interstate now going, how did you get that up? How does it work? What do you do? What blah, blah, blah. So we help them out as much as we can. Yeah, so it was a great process, and now the vast majority of our cremations here are shrouded cremation. So that's our little contribution to the world. But we're constantly exploring and trying to, how can people make their own shroud? And we link up with lots of beautiful artists and other people that are doing things, and families can make their own shrouds and make them, at the end of their lives, and contribute to how they're made and decorated and everything. So then afterwards, when the person does die, the family go, oh, remember we did this, and that's exactly how she wanted it, all that sort of stuff. So that's all very beautiful. And then you come down to, just come back to your primary question about caring for the earth as much as we can. Just sensible things like our main utilisation of resources is in fuel and power. So we just work as actively as we can to offset those. So we make a regular supportive contribution to our local land care. Our land care group is focused on the protection of the endangered black gum, which is in our community here in Woodend. Yeah, so they use the funds that we contribute every year to help them in their progress. That's not always just buying more trees. We encourage the families to choose wisely, to choose meaningfully, and then they don't go looking for stuff to buy. If I had gone back and looked at Peter's time, I would have had a burial at the Natural Burial Ground at Carlsruhe, where they would have let us have a big bonfire. We would have had all storytelling around the fire. All our family and friends would have bought food to share, and then we would have just laid him in the earth when we were ready, and then buried, and then filled the grave ourselves. You know, that just would have, you just look at what you're not buying. So a lot of it is about that. It's about really spending enough time to say what really meets your need, not buying stuff to prove that you love someone.
Yeah, definitely.
There's probably a much more articulate answer than that, but essentially, you know, we just don't do stuff. We're still running a business, though. I mean, we still have to print things every now and then, and we still have to. But there's lots of ways you can get around just simple, normal, good practices around reducing waste or zero waste. Like in our sustainability policy, which is freely available on our website, you know, the well-being of my staff and human, social and emotional sustainability is our paramount. Now, that happens to mean that because we all walk gently, that the impact on the environment, you know, is as low as it could possibly be. I don't think there's anyone doing any better than what we're doing. And that's actually what makes us be well. So people go, oh, you know, what are you talking about? You know, I'm not a known diehard sustainability, outspoken, you know, on the streets person, because to me it's not about that. It's about me being authentic. My mum didn't even know that she was an environmentalist. She just didn't, but she was, you know. And I think we've just got to look after each other, move as gently as we can through this, and that by creating meaning, staying true to ourselves, then we won't go looking for other things to do, and that those are the things that have more impact.
Yeah, the mindless, like, I just need to do something, so I'll do anything kind of moments. Yeah. Which is often like when people are grieving or they're in shock, they are often just looking for a bit of a pain relief, really.
100%. So, you know, if you've got no connection to the dead, if you've got no control over the process, if you feel like you're just having to go through the motion of organising a funeral, then you're likely to go and buy 200 plastic baubles that people, you know, wave in the air or something, or heaps of flowers, or some crappy, shiny, ridiculous coffin that you just don't need if you're choosing more from deep down where you live rather than scrambling for meaning. So it really is a matter of what we don't do rather than what we do.
Yeah.
You know, we're actively involved with sustainability festivals and supporting community education around sustainable choices.
So what sort of things do you do at festivals?
Oh, we just hang out, really. We take a shroud and a couple of coffins and, you know, freak the first lot of people out, and then they all settle and everybody copes, and then we're frantic. We just have a constant stream of people coming up desperate to talk. I mean, there's sort of the natural, they're our people, you know, our fellow sustainability going folk. So there's a natural connection with a lot of them, but they're so used to us now that they just go, oh, natural growth is here, good old I live, you know, blah, blah, blah. But the passers-by, they often will come in and burst into tears. Just, oh, thank you, you know. And we don't even need to say that. They can see from the things we've got on display. Calico shroud, no coffin, our little essential oils, and our gold, frankincense and myrrh.
Because a lot of people just don't know there's a choice in it.
They don't know. That's the key, is raising awareness and encouraging people to trust themselves. I mean, the truth of funeral care or funeral responsibilities in Victoria, and this is essentially the same across Australia, is that there's 3 requirements. One is that a doctor certifies, you know, who's died and how they died, and that it's all okay. It was an expected death. The second thing is that the body is cremated or buried or disposed of, is the word, in a legal manner. Now, in Victoria at the moment, that really is only burial or cremation. There's a couple of other things. And the third thing is you have to register the death with birth, death and marriage. Yeah. Now, there is no requirement in there that you have to use a funeral director. There is no law that says you have to use a funeral director. Yeah. There's no reason you can't do all of that yourself, that you can't do it from home. You can transport a body yourself. You can access the cemetery yourself. There's total independence for families to lead their own funeral care. So if you say, well, they're the things I legally have to do as a senior next to kin of a person, that leaves a whole lot of scope, my friend, for what else you can do. So a funeral for you might be just like, I imagined I would have had for my Peter now is, just all friends around a bonfire or a barbie in the backyard with the coffin there and then off to the cemetery. It's endless. The number of things we do in a week, let alone bigger, is different.
Yeah.
So, but you've got to understand, well, what's the law say? What do you have to do first? And they're the only things you have to do. The rest is all urban myth.
Or just tradition or habit.
Yeah, habit. Yeah, that's right.
What is some greenwashing that happens in the funeral industry? Because I've heard that cardboard, for example, coffins aren't as sustainable as they sound.
I think we need to turn it all into a positive and say anything that comes up that gets people to have a conversation is positive. So take for a moment those pods that you were talking about, and you look at the shape of those pods as they're presented at the moment.
Like an egg shape.
Like a beautiful egg shape, yep. So they started out as an artist's impression of what that might look like and how we could make memorial forests out of the dead. So that's a natural burial ground, simply what that is. Now, you can call it whatever you like or change it whatever you like, but if you lay a body naturally in the earth without it having been embalmed at a shallow depth, without ornate headstones and things like that, all the things that make up the principles of natural burial, then that is a natural burial. And trees grow from that. People are planted under trees all the time, or new growth is made or whatever. It's not this sort of miraculous cure or answer to things.
It's not a brand new thing that, is...
Yeah, it's just not. And none of it is. All of what we practice as holistic practitioners and as sustainable practitioners, all of us, it's ancient. It's ancient. And we talk about we're remembering. We're helping people to remember. And it's a re-pioneering of these things. It's not, here's me claiming I've created shrouded cremation in Australia. And look, I've been the person that's made that be commercially, legally available to the Victorian, and one day it will be the Australian market. But talk to me about, the Varanasi. They've been cremating people on pyres forever.
In India, do you mean?
Yeah. So none of it's new. It's all ancient, and it's all proven, and it's all right. It's just how do you bring it into a modern context? How do you make it available to everybody, equally accessible and affordable and safe and meets our health and standards and all those sort of things? Because a lot of the things are a bit out there. So just close your eyes for a minute and think, how would you get a dead body into that pod?
How much manhandling do you have to do?
Well, and can it even do it? Rigor mortis is a thing, my friend. And how the leg's got to bend into that, and how big? I'm only 5'2" or something. I'm pretty little, but I'm not a tiny little thing. If I was to squeeze my legs up to my chin and made myself into a ball, that would be a damn big pod that I would need to fit in. And then how deep would the hole need to be to bury it at a depth that meets the legislation? So the legislation requires 75 centimetres above the height of the coffin or the remains. I think it looks beautiful. I think it's gorgeous. But realistically, is it something that I'll see come onto the consumer market? No, I don't.
And is it any better than being buried in a shroud and having a tree planted above you?
No.
It's exactly the same, effectively.
That's exactly the same. But if you aesthetically like that idea, and you're going to pay for it, God knows what they would cost if they were actually available. But what they have done is create an enormous amount of global conversation, which is brilliant. Because a lot of people say, oh, just, park me under a tree, put me in the earth and plant a tree on top of me, that'll make me happy. And so it's created conversation. And if a family's gone off and gone, oh, Mum, look at this, it's beautiful. What would you want if you died, Mum? And it's caused a conversation, then that is brilliant. The same with the mushroom suit.
Oh, yeah, so the mycelium shroud.
So that was actually came from the work of Dr. Pia Italandi, who's an Australian designer, and she's the originator of those ideas, and then it's been picked up by different people across the world, which is great, but it did start with her. So those suits, but it's the same thing. Great, make a suit. But does that mean if you want to dress your person in normal clothes or in their favourite outfit or whatever that you can't because you're using the suit? And how does the suit get on the dead? And what's wrong with just wrapping them up in cotton and then sprinkling a good composty kind of mixture of mushroom spores and things over them in a natural burial grave where, so I sound a little bit cynical and I really don't mean to be, but I do think the greatest purpose of these items is conversation causing, not the actual item themselves, because you just don't need them.
And you mentioned earlier that a lot of what you're doing and a lot of what these natural alternatives are just us remembering what humanity has done for millennia to handle our deceased.
That's a much better way of putting it.
But I actually think that's a nice analogy for what the sustainability movement in general is trying to do. We're trying to remember, how do you live without plastic? How do you make your own bread and grow your own veggies locally so you're not importing them from Chile or wherever else in the world? How do we live the way we did? It was only a century ago that we lived that way.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly right. And, when you died a century ago, and sometimes I'll come up against challenges from the trustees of country cemeteries where I want to do natural burial. And the first thing I'll do is sit with those people with absolute respect and honour and say thank them for their service in, managing cemeteries. And I'll invite them to tell me how and where their grandmother died. And because these blokes are all in their 70s and 80s, so their grandmother died a long time ago. And they'll talk about how she died at home and how the lady down the street knew how to lay her body out and that she stayed in the house for a few days and the priest came and blessed her and everybody was comfortable with her dead body and everybody knew how to manage it. And the family got fed and the instruments got brought in and the wake began and the men made a coffin and someone bought the cart or the, truck or something up and they drove the person to the church themselves and they dug the grave themselves and they laid the coffin in the grave and they filled it themselves. And the world wasn't crazy about death because they knew what to do. They knew the map. They knew the pathways. And the person that was dying knew that they were safe.
They'd be cared for that way because they'd seen it done.
Yeah.
And that leads me to a question that I've been rolling around in my mind for a while, which is, I feel like with these amazing advances in medicine and our ability to care for sick people, we're not exposed to death as much as people used to be back in that era that you're describing now. And even infant mortality and the mortality of mothers as they give birth is so far lower than it used to be.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a connection between this fear we have for the planet as we watch ecosystems dying. There's a balance there somehow. I don't know. Do you have any reflection on that?
I just think we're all spoiled. I think we've been so spoiled and so safe and so, in first world situations, of course, so privileged that we're in such a place that, even if you look at our political landscape, the things that we're choosing to vote, that swing our vote from one to another, is something that such a small percentage of the population is privileged enough to be able to talk about. Even things that matter as much as marriage equality and things. But if you're starving in the desert, then these sort of things don't matter, and so much of the world is still impacted by lack of food, by lack of health care. There's not enough for everybody. And so I think we have become spoiled. I think we've forgotten to recognise how fortunate fortunate we are, and that you have to protect what we've got. So my answer is yes, I agree with you totally.
Yeah, I guess what you're saying is that we're so used to being safe that we've forgotten that everything around us could fall apart, and then we really won't be safe.
Yeah, we really won't be. That's right. And that's the gift of this COVID thing. Is a great big kick up the bum to have a good hard think. Everybody, what do you really need? If you haven't been able to access junk food for, what are we up to, week 4 or something, and you're fine.
You're actually fine. Yep.
Fine. That's right. If the hardest part's been the social connection, but if you think about what people have gone without, why do we need to drive to Melbourne to go to work all the time? We can work perfectly well from home, at least most of the time. Why is telehealth only now a Medicare-funded benefit? That's where you see your doctor online. So you still have your appointment, but for so many of the medical appointments, you don't need to be in their office.
Yeah. And for a lot of people, it's very stressful to get down to the doctor's office and then sit there for an hour waiting for your appointment.
Yep. And this all, those sort of things. So this is going to be interesting, I think, as a really big reminder about what really matters. What are we prepared to do to protect it? Look at the women that are having their babies, and some places their husbands or partners aren't even allowed to be with them, and others they're allowed to be there for the birth, and then they have to leave the hospital the minute the baby's born, and big stuff, really big stuff. So it's going to be an interesting reminder, isn't it? Shake up.
That we are mortal.
And that these resources are finite, and we need to act now to protect them. It's all this big delicious pot, isn't it? And we all contribute a bit to the big mix. And what we're doing here is just saying, well, in the end, when it comes time to say goodbye, it can be as considered and gentle and careful as people, for many, many people, especially in our communities, rural communities and all sorts of sustainably focused communities, that's consistent with how they've lived. And we know for sure in terms of social and emotional sustainability, that's really good for the people that survive them.
It's a really nice thing to be able to share with people that, they have those choices and that there's a lot to think about and feel through, and you don't have to rush it, and you can start thinking about it now.
Yeah, and that's the big take-home item is planning. And this COVID thing has shown that up a lot, the difference for families who had a conversation, or God forbid a whole plan, they're much better suited to manage the restrictions that are now around them with COVID than families who have never had a conversation. So they're dealing not only with ideas they've never thought about before, tackling the fact that their person has died and they're exhausted and fragile and sad, and there's all these big restrictions. So, planning and thinking ahead is just so imperative. It's an act of love. I love you enough to let you know that this is what I'd like.
Yeah, and to have a conversation that may be painful and that you don't want to think about.
Yeah, but it's only for the good. And you don't have to bang on about it every day, just because I bang on about it every day doesn't mean everybody else does. But we often will say to people, here, come, we've got all these documents that we send out that people can consider, and information and links and suggestions, and they explore all that, and then they've got a planning document that they complete, and then there's like, put it in your drawer, you're done. That's enough for people to, something happens, to pick people that love you will pick that document up, and that'll provide them with the treasure map of right, this is what you wanted. We don't really encourage prepaid funerals here. I don't think it's a good consumer choice for people because it limits choice when the time comes, but also it denies people that you love the opportunity to create funeral for you. And so if you dictate too much, you're actually, people need funerals. The role of funerals, and there's a whole other conversation as well, but they're really, really important. They're important for how we process grief. And if we deny people the opportunity to curate those funerals, then they're not getting their early bereavement experiences that they really need. So we don't like prepaid much. That's not to say you shouldn't be, if you want to be financially responsible and put money aside and all that sort of stuff, that's fine.
Yep. And have it written into your will that a certain amount goes to funeral expenses and all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's right. But to have a list that says you have to have this coffin and you have to go to that church, you have to have that song, you have to have everything, which a prepaid does require people to do, then it's denying a lot of opportunity for engagement. I mean, the whole conversation about natural burial and the role of cemeteries and home-based death care and caring for the dead and what actually happens to our bodies and all that stuff, that's fascinating. You know, it's just so cool about it. You can just gently slide back to nature and you don't have to stamp on it as you go out.
That was Libby Moloney from Natural Funerals. Next up is Helen Bodicomb, an artist who made her own gorgeous, fully biodegradable shroud.
I've been working predominantly with glass and stone for a long time, but I've also been interested in working with ephemera or materials which change over time. And I guess because my main practice has been anchored in the traditions of mosaic for a long time, and because conventionally mosaic is about making an artefact that's permanent somehow because it's made out of glass or stone or mortar, I was interested in, I guess, for this particular work, shroud, to think in more temporal terms, so thinking more about time and change. And and it was part of my final PhD exhibition at Lot 19 last August.
So the intention for this is very literally to be a shroud for you at the end of your life, is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm the final ingredient, I guess, because I guess the idea is to create a shroud with a decorative form on it, which I guess has been made using mosaic methods, however, not conventional mosaic materials, because all the materials bar the gold leaf tesserae are designed, in fact, to biodegrade once my body is wrapped within the shroud. And I guess because I've had a long-standing relationship with Vaughan, which is where I'm speaking from now, and my partner and I decided quite some years ago that we would like to be buried there. I guess coming from a culture of, our families tend to lean towards cremation, and for a long time that's been the preferred method of body disposal. For us, it's about actually becoming part of the physical fabric of the place of Vaughan beyond our own lifetime. So I just came upon this idea. I guess it was influenced in some ways too by the fact that my father was dying at the time, and in fact by the time I made this work he had himself died. Dad was dying for quite a long time. He was elderly, he had a form of cancer. But also I think I've come from a family culture where we've talked about death a lot. My father worked in a death-related industry, you might say, and he certainly spent a lot of his time and energy professionally at end-of-life situations with people. So I've always been comfortable with acknowledgement of death being part of life, and I suppose that's what this shroud work is very much a part of. It's more thinking of death not as an end point, but actually as a transitional phase.
So all of the materials except for the gold, as you mentioned earlier, are biodegradable.
Yes.
So that deliberately there will be nothing left except for some tiny fragments. And the gold itself was symbolic for you, especially in this region, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, this is the gold field, so there's a kind of symbolic repatriation of that material back to the gold fields. All the other materials were made using latex as a binder, which will deteriorate quite quickly when immersed with moisture and bacteria and all the other things that are going to get going once, you become a bit more soupy. and I used human hair and I used wood ash from the wood stove, and so I made my own tesserae and actually made the artwork on the shroud, the motif, which was actually a spider orchid, a particular orchid which is endemic only to this area, in fact, Chewton, Campbell's Creek, Vaughan. I guess it's talking about rarity and the specifics of location and the relationship that we have with a place and the enduring nature of the relationship, albeit through an impermanent material.
And I think there's a nice symbolic element to that as well, because orchids pretty much disappear for most of the year, and then for a small time they flower and they're sort of visible. And a lot of these orchids are quite tiny in the scale of like the earth and the landscape, aren't they?
Exactly.
Kind of like our own lives, we pop up and disappear.
Exactly. I think that sort of fleeting, fragile transience is what I was wanting to highlight, and I think we do get very caught up with our own hubris, and we've only got to look at the situation unfolding around us at the moment
With the COVID-19.
to see plenty of evidence for that. Yeah, the COVID-19, see the full spectrum of fragility, hubris, denial, the fairly rapid and the reality of it, really, which is pretty sobering when you see it en masse.
Yeah, because I think we have come to a point in human evolution where we feel quite safe. We feel like the medical system will be able to save us if something happens. And I mean, there's always exceptions to that. There are certain illnesses that scare us all, but there's a certain sort of level of like, we expect to live to 80 or 90 these days.
Well, it's almost like it's our right, isn't it? And I think that's where, when something comes to threaten that, there is, it's unjust, isn't it?
When actually, for the majority of human history, people were lucky to live to 40.
Yeah, it's interesting, depending on who you were. I mean, for a long time, I thought that some of the Greek philosophers who we look back to, Aristotle and a lot of the the heroes, the thinking heroes of that era, how long did they live? Well, a lot of them actually lived into their 80s and even into their 90s because they were wealthy, they ate well.
Yeah.
If they didn't die of the lead poisoning and so on, it's still very much been connected with wealth and power and privilege. Absolutely. Actually, those who've lived long and those who've lived short.
Yeah.
Lives.
And, the privilege of not having to give birth, which is, very life-threatening through most of human history.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, the shroud idea was very much one that was about the notion of sort of continuity of life. And I can remember after Dad died, in fact, I was part of that photographic survey that profiled a lot of artists and were displayed during the last Castlemaine State Festival. And the photographer kept trying to make a date to do the shoot with me. And it was during the period when Dad was actively dying. And eventually he died. And she said, well, can we do this shoot? And I said, well, yeah, I can. But I said, there's just one place where I want to be at the moment, and that's actually in the water at Vaughan. And that, being part of the river, I know for a lot of people who live in this region, being in the res, on your back, in the water, with the dragonflies.
Staring up at the blue sky.
Like physically being a part of it is deeply soothing, and there is a sort of existential comfort that comes of that feeling. I think it's fairly, very sort of clearing and curing and soothing. And the shroud idea for me is somehow connected with that. It's about physically becoming part of what I'm already a part of, because I eat the vegetables that grow in the soil here. It's an affirmation of that continuity and a continuation of life, as I said, through a sort of transition. It's just a change that happens. It's not an end of one thing and the beginning of another. It's just a transition to something else, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And to allow yourself to decompose in the earth is so fundamentally different to having your ashes and having them scattered, like what you're giving back to the earth in terms of the microflora and fauna. It's vastly different.
So, I mean, it's interesting when you start looking into the logistics of this sort of thing too, because once I hit on the idea of looking for a shroud, I did a lot of trawling online, and then, of course, all my Google search engine stuff meant I kept getting links to, pop-ups from crematoria and embalming equipment. Embalming equipment kept popping up everywhere.
It's amazing. That's such a people wanting to live forever or be preserved forever, which is the complete opposite of what you're looking for.
But once you start Googling one thing,
it all comes up.
The whole landscape comes up, which is pretty interesting. But in the end, I bought a shroud which is custom made for green burial. It's made of 100% bamboo. And it was actually imported into Australia by a company in Queensland called Final Touch. But I did find it's not easy to buy them already made, and unless you design things properly, there are logistical requirements, like you need to be able to slide a board in underneath, and you need to be able to tie a body into it securely, and it needs to fit.
Yeah. It needs to be the right size for you.
I mean, that they are one size fits all, but certainly if you're going to, as I did, make a motif and fit that to the shroud, I actually had to try the shroud on first. So that was the first step for me, was calling a friend and saying, would you mind coming to my studio? Sure, what for? I want you to wrap me up in my burial shroud. It's a dress rehearsal.
That's a good friend.
Yes, she's a very good friend.
So what was the process like because it would have been hours and hours of painstaking stitching and thinking and planning and designing this pattern that goes onto the shroud. What was that process like for you?
Yeah, I consulted with various people. I talked with Francis Cincotta actually about the motif itself, and then I wanted to be able to make tesserae using material that had been part of my life, and so I actually collected a heap of wood ash from my stove and sifted it and experimented with making tesserae, or I kind of made thick mats made from PVA glue and wood ash, and when they had dried and I flipped them over a few times, I cut them up into lots of little squares, and so a lot of the mosaic was actually made out of those. I collected hair from my partner and my children and my dog and my own hair, and I included those in some of those tesserae as well. And so materially it consists of us and our lives, our collective lives, and that of me and my families. And so it was a very considered process. And it is a kind of weird thing actually, making something like that, understanding as you do it what its final intention is. It's a bit sobering, but it's kind of a bit ironic and tongue-in-cheek, and you've got to ride with the humorous aspect of it too.
You mentioned that you mix it all with PVA glue. Is that biodegradable or degradable, PVA?
It's water soluble. So latex is the primary biodegradable binder that I've used in that mosaic on the shroud. And PVA has helped to stabilise and bond. So I've actually used PVA and latex together. I'm very fortunate that at Lot 19 I've got Ewan Wood as one of my neighbours, and of course as a museum preparator and master of binders and biodegradability and all that sort of stuff. I had his expertise to draw on a bit, which was terrific. It's one of the lovely things about being at Lot 19.
Yeah. Again, community.
Yeah, that's right.
And how long have you been at Lot 19?
Long time. 13 years. And 13 years, and I hope to be there till I leave in a shroud.
That was artist Helen Bodicomb. As ever, with anything on this program, please look at the episode description at saltgrass.podbean.com to find links and information about the topics and the people interviewed. This program was made possible with support from the Community Broadcasting Foundation. Find out more at cbf.org.au. And this program was produced in partnership with the Mount Alexander Sustainability Group, MASG, and Main FM.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change. Saltgrass.
Listen to all episodes of Turning the Goldfields Green on saltgrass.podbean.com.